Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here today. This is Nicole with Topaz, and today we are here to talk about watercolor painting with Topaz Impression. Topaz Impression is our latest plugin here at Topaz, and with Topaz Impression you can easily recreate the look and feel of a luminous and soft watercolor painting. And so today we're going to be exploring some of the best brushes, textures, and different settings to take a look at in Impression that are going to help you create more naturalistic type of watercolor paintings. So with that, let's take a look at some before and afters to start off with, and then I will jump on into the program. Alright, so this is our after image. This was created with Topaz Impression only. Here's before. And when I looked at this, I thought, I really like the subject and the composition. It just didn't have very much oomph or color or really anything exciting going on about it, and I thought it kind of looked like a perfect subject for a watercolor-esque look, and so with Topaz Impression I was able to create this very quickly. We'll probably go in and use this image first for today. Here's an image that's also with Topaz Impression only. Here's before and after. With Topaz Impression, you're able to not only come in and change the way that the image looks as far as applying natural brush strokes, but you can also change different colors very easily and really boost up the brightness or luminosity, which is really important within the watercolor digital workflow, because most watercolors are usually painted on some sort of lighter paper, and that lighter paper really comes through since you're dealing with a water-based paint, and that luminosity or that kind of lightness really shines through in watercolor. So you're able to get that very quickly within Impression. So we'll be going over some of those settings here today as well. But sometimes when you're after a more flat, less detailed watercolor, you can take it into another program first to eliminate some of those details. And Simplify is a great program to do that with, because that's really what Simplify is there for. It's there to simplify your image, and it does that by taking out details based upon a size-based scale. So you can take out small details, more medium details, and leave just the larger details like we did here. And then I took this simplified image into Topaz Impression to get this final watercolor painting effect. And this is probably my favorite workflow currently when it comes to digital watercolors using Topaz products. Now this image actually took advantage of Topaz Clean, and I don't have the clean image, but I'll go ahead and show you this workflow as well. Clean, instead of reducing the details themselves, reduces the texture of the image, which in and of itself reduces some of those texture details, so you're able to come in and bring in a less texturized image and still get a more flat watercolor very quickly with Topaz Impression, and get that naturalistic brush stroke that you might be after to get that more realistic watercolor effect. Let's see here. Lastly, we have this image here, and let's see what I did here. Here's the original image, which I love, but I thought this is kind of a very nice subject for a watercolor, because I have these dark tree trunks against this really light foliage. And so first I took it directly into Topaz Impression and just applied a preset, and I really enjoyed the overall effect, but it was quite a detailed effect, so I wanted to see if I could get a different type of watercolor as well. And I ended up taking it into Simplify and then Restyle, or then Impression, then Restyle, and ended up with this result. So we'll go over this as well. Let's go ahead and start over here with our image of our little girl here. Alright, so here's our original background image, and I'm just going to make a quick copy of that by going to Control-J. And as I said before, this end result was done with Topaz Impression only, so we're just going to take this background copy directly into Topaz Impression by going to Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Impression. It's going to open up Topaz Impression. And the first thing I want to go ahead and talk about is just the more simple way of getting to a watercolor effect. And that is going to be through our presets. Our presets are going to open up automatically over here on the right-hand side. And when you first open up into Topaz Impression, you'll see a list of featured presets. All the way at the bottom is our one featured watercolor effect that we have for you. If you come down to the very bottom, just click on that. It's applied to your image. Now this might not be the type of watercolor effect that you're after. Here's before, here's after. So what you can do is come on into your preset drop down. Featured is at the top, but if you keep on going down, you'll see painting, and within painting is where you'll find the rest of your watercolor presets. If you just scroll down, or you can take the bar over here on the right and just take that on down to the W's. And we can start off with watercolor 1, just to show you the different effects that we have for you. I believe we have 6 different watercolors in here for you, and all of them are really trying to flatten out your image, reduce the contrast, get rid of some of the detail, but they're all just starting points usually. Sometimes you'll be lucky and you'll find something that you just love on your image immediately with a preset and you say okay and you're done. But a lot of times, especially when you're creating these watercolor images, usually they're so specific in the way that the brushstroke needs to be applied. You need to go in just a little bit and adjust some settings, but you usually just need to do 1 or 2. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so let's go ahead and for this image start with maybe this. I kind of like the watercolor 5 preset, the way that it is simplifying my image. Here's before and after and reducing everything. I don't like the way that it's applied its color, but I like the brush stroke itself and the opaqueness, so I'm going to go ahead and start there. And when you click on watercolor 5, you'll see a little circular icon show up right in the middle of that preset preview. Just click on that. It'll pull open and slide open that slider panel for you. Beyond just the more subjective kind of what I'm seeing in my mind's eye for this particular image, which is something much more colorful, and beyond those type of observations, there are a couple areas that you definitely want to keep an eye out for within this preset panel, especially if you're coming in and you're manually working on certain things. We're going to go through a fully manual creation of a watercolor here in just a second, but there's several things that I just immediately look at. Number 1, my brush type. The brush type is usually for these watercolor effects going to be one of these types of brushes where you see a little bit of opaqueness in there. So you see a little bit through the brush stroke to the underlying gray area. It's not a completely solid white. So something like this or something like this type 16 are used quite often for these watercolor effects, and that's because it allows for you to really play around with how the strokes are overlapping one another, as far as if you see through to the strokes below, if the colors blend and make a new color. Lots of things that you would characterize for watercolor paintings. Those brush strokes really help you get to that when it starts out with a little bit of opaqueness in there. Then the other thing you want to really come and jump down to as far as the different brush options you have, the paint opacity. As you take your paint opacity to the right, your paint strokes become much more solid, as you see over here in the picture. As you take it to the left, it becomes more opaque, more transparent, or it becomes less opaque, I'm sorry, more transparent, and you can start to blend those brush strokes together to get a much more smooth effect, and I think that's really important whenever you're working with this watercolor effect. Another area that I immediately go down to that really helps to give you that watercolor effect pretty quickly is the texture area. And a couple of our watercolor presets don't have texture to them, so you might choose that and then come down and say, it doesn't really have a lot of texture to it, I wonder why. Just jump down to this texture module at the very bottom of the slider panel, and you'll see your texture and which texture is applied, and sometimes nothing is applied. So I like to go ahead and take my texture up fairly high for watercolor effects, and apply a paper type setting. And that's really going to be a good starting point for a realistic watercolor effect. Getting something, one of my favorites is Paper 7. You click on Paper 7. If we scroll into the image, you'll see that this paper effect has been applied to the image, and that really translates to a more realistic effect. And you can take your strength up or down, so it's not as strong or a little bit stronger. And if you want a really strong texture but you don't want as much of that, or strong paper look but you don't want as much shadow along those ridges in your paper, you can come and change your light direction as well. And we'll talk about that here a little bit further. But that really kind of softens that shadowy effect that you get from those little divots in the paper itself. Excuse me. You can also adjust the size of your texture. If you want the paper to seem larger, you can take that size up, or smaller, take that size down, and that takes the scale of the paper texture up or down to match your image and what you're going to be printing it on. So those are several areas that I immediately go and look at for watercolor. That's going to start to give you a more realistic effect right away. Now that I've kind of made sure that I have the right type of stroke type that I want and the texture, I've changed my lighting direction a little bit. I'm going to just work on the certain things for this particular image that I want to kind of boost up, and that's a lot of my color issue going on here. It looks like within the preset creation, I wanted to take that brightness way up and really bring out that luminosity, but for this particular image, it really blew out a lot of the color that I had in that original. So all I'm going to do is come in and take my brightness down. That immediately brings in some color. I'm also going to take my contrast down, because I really like to take contrast down to really bring out some color in desaturated images like we have here in this original. If you take your contrast down and boost up that overall saturation, all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of colors coming out of that, and not as much depth, which will help to create a more flat and 2D effect that you might be after for this watercolor effect. So now that I've taken my contrast down and my brightness down, now everything feels a little bit less luminous. I don't really feel a lot of lightness here in this image. One of the cool things about Topaz Impression is the contrast between this overall lightness slider, which is located in the color module, and the brightness slider, which is located in the lighting module. The overall lightness is going to affect the paint strokes themselves. So you can really play around with this overall lightness of the image and get the paint as light or dark on an overall scale or in an individual color range scale as you'd like. This lighting and brightness is going to really affect the actual overall brightness of the image. So you can come in and maybe still have a really bright base like this, but take your overall lightness down to kind of contrast and get a little bit more of color or darkness to your strokes. And that's what I tend to do with these watercolors, to take my brightness up, which again will give me kind of that really lighter base that I'm looking for, and then the overall lightness of the strokes down, which gives me a little bit more texture in my whites and really allows for some of that tone to fill in those really bright spots that's been created with this brightness slider. And now I feel like I have a more accurate type of watercolor effect. So very quickly I've been able to get to this stage, which I'm fairly happy with actually. I really like the amount of contrast that by taking the contrast down I really allowed for a lot of color to come into my subject themselves, and as well as taking this overall saturation has really boosted up some of the blues back here. But if you're unaware of the color module within Topaz Impression, or if you're just new to Topaz Impression, take a look at this color module. It is so much fun. because you get to really boost up certain color ranges. So if you remember within the after example that I had shown you, there was this really bright aqua line going across the image. And that was something I was able to achieve very quickly just by taking my mouse and scrolling over the different color swatches in the color panel here. So as I scroll over here, the red, you'll see some cross-hatching going on in the red shades or the red ranges within the image. Same thing with the yellow or the orange and now the yellow. And so you can come in and you can individually change these color ranges, but one of the things I noticed while I went over the image or went over these color swatches is that this aqua hue or this aqua range lit up just this area right in front of our girl here. And I thought, oh, that would be cool if I could just boost up that particular area. So I was able to click on my aqua range and come into my aqua saturation and just boost that up real quick. And take the lightness down. And then come into my aqua hue and move that to an area that I liked. So I'm going to try to kind of get it more towards that green, which you see coming in right now. Here we go. I'm going to take that even darker. And this is only affecting that aqua color because I'm in my specific aqua color range. So you have a lot of control to come in and manipulate these colors, and even areas that you really didn't think had a lot of color or color differentiation between the next range, such as this. There's a lot of gray happening here. By just scrolling over these color ranges, sometimes the program will separate these color ranges into interesting different ranges that you can come in and manipulate separately. So let's go ahead and change her purple of her shirt, make that a little bit more saturated, maybe take the lightness up as well, and maybe even take a little bit of that and go, well, maybe we'll go to the right and see what happens there with our hue. We go a little bit more pink. I'm going to take my overall saturation up as well. And you get the idea. So fairly quickly we were able to get from here to create a nice flat decontrasted or less contrasty watercolor effect. I'm going to go ahead and press OK and get back to Photoshop to show you the before and after. Here's before. Here's after. And we start off with a very simple preset. Only switched a few things around because most of the effect was already there for us. Was able to end up with this effect. And as I scroll in, you can see just how realistic this really can be. You see a lot of flatness here, some nice strong edges, a little bit of wet fringing effect there going on with her hair that you might get within a watercolor. A nice strong color as well. Alright, so the next effect I want to go over, let's see here, we'll go ahead and I think we'll go through this workflow since I showed it off in several other images and make sure that we get to this workflow. And we'll go through the individual, more manual creation of our watercolor effect within this workflow. But again, with this particular image, what I did was, here's my original, and I took it into Topaz Impression first, and then I went through the process that I just did with the subject of the girl, but there was just too much detail. I wanted it to be a much flatter, less detailed effect that you can achieve quite easily with watercolor effects in real life. So to do that, I thought, okay, what can I do to make my image less detailed? So there's many ways to get rid of detail, but one of my favorite is just going through Topaz Simplify. So I'm just going to do a quick background copy here, just Control J. You can do Command J on your Mac. Do a filter, Topaz Labs. I'm going to go into Topaz Simplify first and just reduce my overall detail. Now within Simplify, you can sit here and go into all the right-hand side and all those adjustments, but what I'm going to do is actually go directly down in my painting category, down to watercolor, and click on watercolor, and it's going to give me a watercolor effect. Now this is going to give me a more simplified watercolor effect. It's very different from the watercolor effect you're going to get within Topaz Impression. Impression is going to be a much more naturalistic effect, whereas Topaz Simplify works on that removal of detail. So this is a great base to take into Topaz Impression if you want to carry this effect even further to get a more naturalistic effect like we do want to do. So I'm just going to press OK. And it's going to process back into Photoshop, and then I'll take it into Topaz Impression. And by eliminating all the detail within my rocks on the left, within the water itself, within the reflection on the lower right with the boats, and even within the texture of the boats themselves, it really allows for me to get more of a flat watercolor characteristic that I'm after. So now that I'm back in Photoshop, I'm just going to press Control J again. Get another copy. I'll make sure that I label this Simplify, and now we're going to take this one into Impression. Go Filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Impression. And now right away everything just feels a little bit more hand-drawn versus computer-generated, I guess you could say. So, except for these colors are going kind of crazy. But what I'm going to do is actually just start out at 0 and go through this manual process, kind of how I would go into the program and manually create a watercolor effect and the things that I would look for. I kind of already covered it, but I'm going to show you once again just kind of that process of the things that I look at when creating a watercolor. So instead of doing anything or clicking a preset, I'm just going to click on this top right icon, the slider icon, just to get into my slider panel without choosing a preset. And then I'm going to press this little reset arrow, and that's going to reset everything back to default. By default, everything is set back to 0, except for our brush type. There's always going to be a brush selected. So if you scroll in, you'll see there is a brush stroke applied, and that is going to be the type 1 brush stroke, which is a very nice brush stroke if you're after something like an impasto or trying to start off on an oil painting. But it's not necessarily the best brush stroke for me for working with watercolors. You could sit there and go into all of these brush slider options and really work with the brush to try to create a watercolor-esque effect. But it's going to be easier if you jump right down to, I'm finding a lot of luck with type 12, which you wouldn't think it just by pressing it. Type 12 or type 16. I think I'm going to start off with type 16. Now again, you wouldn't necessarily think that you're going to have a lot of luck with a watercolor effect when you first click on type 16, but if you look at the brushstroke itself within this little image of it, you'll see that there's some transparency in the middle of that, and that's going to lend itself to giving a more realistic see-through type brush that you're going to usually get with watercolors if you're using a lot of water within the way that you're painting. So as I scroll in, I can see I'm not really seeing through a lot of this. I'm only seeing through the very middle of these brush strokes. The very first thing I'm going to do is come down to my paint opacity and take that to the left. And as I take that to the left, these paint strokes become more and more transparent, where I can start seeing the paint strokes below, and the colors start blending into one another to create other colors, like you'd see a lot of in watercolor painting, especially if you have a lot of water fringe going on. Before I continue on with anything else, what I like to do is jump down to my texture and apply a texture. And my favorite texture currently for watercolor is the one that I've already shown, is going to be the paper number 7. It's just my preference, but you have all these different types of paper here for you. I believe we have 12 or 13 different paper presets. But this is paper 7, and I'm going to take that strength pretty high. And I'll leave my size the same, and we'll scroll in. And you can see that we have quite a bit of texture now in there. I don't necessarily want as deep as shadows that's happening within the texture itself, so I'm just going to take my light direction, which is coming from this very far upper right corner right now, and move that just by dragging that little toggle towards the center. It's going to give me a more flat paper effect where I'll still get as much of the texture, but just not as deep of the texture. So a little bit happier with that lighting effect. The other thing that affects is also the paint stroke texture, which is also, for me, important within watercolor to flatten out. If you have a very, very heavy slanting light direction on the paint strokes, you're going to start seeing all the texture of the brush simulation in those text strokes, which you don't necessarily see a lot of within watercolor painting. So this helps to flatten the overall effect out. Now that I've done that, the other thing that I want to go ahead and do before I go anywhere else, back up to my brush stroke, is going to be down in my lighting area. After I've already changed the light direction, I now want to take my contrast down. And that's just going to, again, take a little less depth out of the image, and or take a little depth out of the image, make it a little bit more flat. And then I'm going to take my brightness up, but my overall lightness, because I want my strokes to still be a little bit darker, I'm going to take my overall lightness down. So far we've gone from this image to here with just a few different choices that we've made. So I'm fairly happy here, but I do want to look at a couple things that I'm noticing right off the bat. Number one, it seems a little bit messy. I want to have a little bit cleaner of a brush stroke. Currently, especially around the little mast of my boats here on the horizon line, there's a lot of spilling over of that brush stroke. Now, if this was a preset, I would say, you know, to eliminate that, check out your spill slider to take that down, because that's what the spill slider actually helps to achieve, is that spilling over of the edge. But if you're manually coming in and working with this, that spill is by default all the way at 0, so it's actually being created by the brush stroke itself. There's several ways that you can kind of work with this. You can take your brush size down. Taking your brush size down will take brush size down of everything, though. So all of a sudden you start to get an effect of a very small brush stroke with lots of the background seeping through. So I don't necessarily want that. So what I can do is come down to my stroke width and length and individually change that. So to me, this seems like I have just kind of a wider stroke. So I'm going to take my width down. As I take my width down, I notice, okay, I still am seeing some of that background seep through. So I'm going to come up to my brush size, take that up a little, and just kind of go back and forth until I have the coverage and the look that I want all together. So that really helped to smooth out the spilling over of the background here and kind of make it more into a watercolor effect instead of more of a blotchy effect. So I really like what happened there. Here's before and after our whole effect so far. Now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to keep coming down. The paint volume, I tend to stay away from when it comes to watercolor. The paint volume is going to give you buildup of paint, which is really important when it comes to certain types of paint, like oil or you know, palette knife type of painting. But with watercolor, I keep that down to give a nice, smooth effect. Paint opacity is where I want it. Stroke rotation, I'm pretty happy with for this image. Stroke color variation, I like to take up a little bit. What that stroke color variation will do is vary the stroke color. It can go really, really wild, like this, if you take that high. Or if you just take it 0.02, 0.03, you're going to start seeing some different colors of the same tone come in, and it starts to give you just kind of some overlapping effect. Oop, that was the wrong. Let me go back there. Some overlapping effect and some texture within the paint, even though it's a watercolor effect. So I'm going to leave that at 0.02, and that kind of gives a nice bit of texture to my sky now with that blue. As I scroll down here, I'm going to, with my spill and smudge, if I wanted to get a little bit more spillage around the edge, I could take that up, but I don't. Smudge is going to just smooth the edges out. It's kind of like taking your thumb and with charcoal and smudging the charcoal with your thumb on a piece of paper. So it kind of gives a smooth, lined effect. So you can add it in here, and it can have some nice effects, or you can choose to leave it out. But that smudge can help sometimes get a little bit more of a smooth effect for you. The coverage, if you want to open up the edges, like you see a lot of watercolors sometimes, especially on paper, where the paper will be on the edges, and only the watercolor itself, the paint will be in the middle. If you kind of want to get that effect, play with your coverage a little bit. Take your coverage down and then take your coverage transition down to get kind of those edges seeping through. And then you can change the background color of your edges by coming all the way down to your texture area, coming into your background, choosing the background color of your choice. So let's say I want to choose something that has a little bit more yellow. Press OK, and it's applied in the background there. So those are my different brush options there, and I'm happy here. Next we have the color area again, and I'm fairly happy with my color. I just want to maybe take my overall saturation a little up, and then I want to change maybe my blues and aquas and greens a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just come over here and scroll over my green area, click on my green. Really want to darken my green up, so I'm going to take that green lightness down. That was a little too far, so let me take that back up. I want to take the little saturation up as well, so I like that. Now here comes the aqua. With the aqua, I'd like to really brighten that up, so I'm going to take that aqua lightness up. Maybe take the saturation up as well. And now with the blues, I'm going to take that blue lightness up as well. Get some of that luminance kind of seeping through from the paper behind it. Maybe take my blue saturation down just a notch. There we go. I like that. And I'm happy. We've gone through all the other options here, and so this is a fully manual or customized watercolor effect that we were able to fairly quickly achieve. Here's before, and here's after. I'm going to press OK. And as I said before, this is kind of my new favorite. These edges don't really feel very watercolory to me. I would not have kept that coverage, but let me show you where I got before. Here we go. Sometimes when doing it on live during the session, it doesn't give me the exact same results, but I do prefer this particular one that I worked on for a little bit longer on my own over that, just because I feel like it gives me more of a watercolor effect. But this particular workflow, going into Simplify first and reducing the detail, and then going into Impression to get that more naturalistic, actual realistic watercolor effect, has been something that I found is very successful in these particular looks. excuse me. And the last one I want to go ahead and take a look at is this image here, and we'll go through this fairly quickly. But I have a lot of people, asking what's one of the, programs that pairs really well with impression. And if you do not have Topaz Restyle and you have Topaz Impression, download Restyle just to check it out. You might not think right off the bat that Restyle is going to be very useful for you, but if you're getting into this more impressionistic, artistic painting, digital painting, that Restyle is an amazing program to have as a pair to Impression. And so I'm actually just going to take this, let me take this background layer into Impression first. And to get this watercolor effect, I chose a preset. Let's see what happens just with the current settings that I had with the last image, though. It's going to be applied automatically to this image once it's done processing. So it'll be the last used settings. Let's see if it has something that I like, and we'll just go from there. Ooh, I do like that. Okay, I like that, except it feels more sketchy for this particular program, or for this particular image. So I'm just going to go into my presets, or my sliders. I'm going to take my coverage all the way to the right to give full coverage. And then I'm going to take my stroke width and take that to the right to give me a little bit more wider of a brush, which will give me nice full coverage as well. Let me scroll in to kind of see what's happening. And I'm pretty happy there. Now I can come into my color module and individually change all of my color adjustments and try to work with that if I wasn't wanting this really bright yellow foliage in the background. But another way of kind of seeing what your color options are is to take your painting from this point and drop it into Restyle. And I'm having so much fun with it, I want to show everybody during each session lately. Because especially with this more painterly, artistic effects that we're going after, just coming in and having some crazy colors applied to it, or different color themes applied to your image all at once, can give you some awesome results and things that you weren't even thinking about. So for this one, maybe I'll go to Nature, Collection, and click on my preset previews and just scroll down and look at all the different options that immediately start to show up. Just really cool different effects. So if I wanted to maybe do Sunset Rampage, I can click on that and it's applied to my image. And now all of a sudden I have this really beautiful kind of peach, pinkish, sunset-y color coming in. If it's not something you like completely, you can always come over here and change the color theme up a little bit or blend it in a different way with your image. I usually take the opacity down or up, or come into my actual color stylings and change some things around to fit the particular image that I'm working with. But you get the idea. You can come in and really manipulate your colors in a very quick and drastic way using Topaz Restyle to really take artistically the image on to a completely different level. So that's the last workflow that I kind of wanted to show you as far as these more painterly effects. Thank you so much again for joining us. I hope you're able to join us for another session later this week, and that you were able to see some of the different tools that you would need to create these more watercolor-esque paintings. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great day, morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and we'll be talking to you soon. Bye.